Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we're having a conversation that most women and mothers really feel uncomfortable having, but it's necessary and it's important. Our guest this morning is Bethany Webster, and her book is entitled Discovering the Inner Mother, a guide to healing the mother wound and claiming your personal power. Bethany, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. It's so great to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Ooh, it's just, you got to just take a deep breath before you even start to talk about this subject because there is so much to unpack. But before we start, I want you to tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm 42 years old. I live in Western Massachusetts, and I'm really excited about this book. I'm a writer, and writing has always been like breathing to me. I started journaling really young. So this book really kind of came out of my own journals and trying to figure out kind of my own path. So it's really fun to be able to offer it from kind of my own organic process.
Sure. And so you're considered a global expert on healing the mother wound. So let's first of all talk about what the mother wound is.
Sure. Yeah. The mother wound, as I define it, has actually 4 levels. The first level is our personal mother wound. So it really comes down to whatever limiting beliefs or patterns that we internalized through the dynamics with our mom. And if we back up a second, a part of it is about how we live in this culture that doesn't value women as much as men, right? Women kind of grow up with this feeling like we're less than, and we're told this through, the media and, all the institutions that we grow up with. It's kind of baked in. So it's kind of about how we inherit these limiting beliefs from our mothers, just by virtue of how that primary relationship is so key to our development. So it's not about blaming our mothers at all. And in fact, it's actually not really about our mothers. It's really about how we internalize so deeply in the fiber of our being these beliefs that we're not good enough, that something's wrong with us. And if we don't kind of work with this, like look at it and reflect on it, it tends to impact our lives, long into adulthood, in ways that are very invisible and automatic. So my effort was really to look at, I started to see how it was impacting myself. But as I looked, I saw that we have a cultural mother wound, and we have a spiritual mother wound as well, meaning can feel a disconnection between a higher power, and also a planetary mother wound, which is the 4th level, which is about the earth itself as a mother. So as you can see, it's a large, pretty significant thing, but the most important though is the personal. And when we start to look at what beliefs we inherited from our mothers and our grandmothers, and it goes back and back. Once we have more awareness about it, more compassion for ourselves, we can start to make some serious, not only personal changes, but I think cultural changes as well, which we really are in need right now, at this time in history, with more women who feel less encumbered by these old beliefs and more ready to become unstoppable, break some barriers, take some stands for truth and justice. So it's a thing that starts out very personal, but has many ripple effects.
Sure. And the thing that you say initially in the book is that it's not about blaming or shaming. And that's the piece you have to get by.
Yeah.
Because there's so many layers to be peeled back from this onion. And when you start to talk about your mother and who you become ultimately because of your mother, it does feel like you're blaming her, but it's so much deeper than that. And what I love is your courage to use the empirical data that is your life to tell this story. And you really struggled early with your relationship with your mother. Talk a little bit about that. And struggle it might be too harsh of a word, but you knew that there were some issues. Let's just say that.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't know, growing up, I thought I had a very normal, even wonderful childhood. It wasn't until I was about 19 years old that I started to have symptoms that were telling a different story. I grew up in a role of supporting my mother very early, being her emotional kind of therapist, counselor, supporter. I played the role of family mediator. I thought that's what little girls did. I didn't see anything wrong with that. But then I started, as I said, in college, start to have panic attacks, get depressed. I was having trouble, just basic life stuff. But I really didn't want to look at that. I was too afraid in the beginning because there's all these messages that if you look at your relationship with your mother, you're automatically a bad daughter. Mm-hmm. So it took me years of avoidance and denial. But once I started having the courage to look at it, I saw that it was really beliefs about myself that were causing all these problems in my career, relationships, every area. And they all boiled down to some themes that I learned from my own mother, based upon how she grew up. And I wanted to shift the dynamic. I wanted to make it a more equal, kind of respectful relationship, but it wasn't possible with my own mother. But through that process, I learned so much about that these beliefs actually helped me to feel safe, but they were deeply unhealthy. So it was like, in letting go of these beliefs, it felt like life or death.
Well, in the book, you talk about being 19 and sort of moving away from your mother, but then you talk about getting counseling and
yes.
how that begins to shift this paradigm. But how do you know that your specific challenges, are directly in correlation to your mother?
Yeah. I would say that, and this is where we take any sense of shame off of it. Like, we all have parents, and all of our parents are human with flaws and their own challenges, their own journeys. So each and every one of us was deeply shaped by our mothers, especially because she's the primary parent right. in most families. And physiologically, it's just how we're built. We depend on our moms so much for those early days and years of our lives. So I think I advise anytime people have struggles or repeating patterns that are causing suffering, that they're feeling stuck in, is to just go back and reflect on what are the themes that I'm living that aren't working? And how does this relate to what I learned? Mm-hmm. So it's really not about blaming. It's more about how your early environment shaped you. Mm-hmm. And I think, and that includes our mothers. But I think there's a lot of resistance to looking at this. A lot of things, there's stereotypes. There's also this pressure that we need to be individuals, and we kind of this denial that we're part of a generational lineage, which has a huge impact.
And for a lot of people, I think looking at your mother's flaws, because that's really what it's tantamount to. You're looking at the things that she did that didn't serve her and they didn't serve you. Let's take a break here, but when we come back, let's peel back some of those layers, because it's such an important conversation, but it's very, very touchy. And unless you can open up to the possibility of nobody's mother was perfect, and those ideologies and those things that we become came from our mother, unless you can really look at that, you can't fix what you won't confront. And so when we come back, let's start to confront some of the things that you talk about in the book. The book is entitled Discovering the Inner Mother. Stay on point. Bethany Webster is our guest this morning. We're back right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. This is a subject that we've never really dove into the way that we are this morning, but it's so important for women who have found themselves on a path of maybe reliving the same cycles and learning how to break those cycles. Our guest this morning is Bethany Webster, and her book is entitled Discovering the Inner Mother, A Guide to Healing the Mother Wound and Claiming Your Personal Power. And before we went to break, you were talking about understanding that there was something wrong. And you find this counselor. And what do you know after you become a young woman that I am in a role with my mother that is unhealthy?
Yeah, exactly. I started to see that the dynamic with my mother was actually showing up in my career difficulties with being visible, with being vocal, with going for what I wanted to do. In my relationships, I was attracting the similar partners, like the same dynamic with my mother. So I was in a lot of, well, often I was in a role of teacher, healer, mentor, coach from way before.
Just fix it.
Yeah.
Because you knew that that's what made your mother happy. That's what pleased her. And it felt like you were on this quest always to please her.
Exactly. So that pleasing behavior pervaded every area of my life. I began to see that this was going to keep going until I did something differently. And so that's when I started to have more courage to look at the fact that in that relationship with my mother, I couldn't be more than that. She wasn't able to shift that dynamic. And unfortunately, she was so identified with that mother role that there was no flexibility for us to shift.
Mm-hmm. It didn't feel like there was flexibility for you to become a woman. It's like you were always the child.
Yeah. And it's ironic because actually in being the child, I was playing the role of her mother, her own mother, the mothering role to her, because she didn't get that from her mother, right? She was what they call a parentified child. So she had to grow up too fast. And so she expected me to do the same. But through my own healing, through therapy early in life, I was able to kind of move past that and want to expand, of course, and grow into something different, into being more empowered, more confident.
But my mother seemed like the more that you wanted to grow into that, the more she wanted to stifle it.
Right, exactly. So I started to see that there's like a power dynamic, happening that is way beyond just, my personal mother, but really in the culture that, women in general aren't given much power in a society. And if you look back at generations of the past, women could be a nurse, a teacher, or a mother, and their lives were inside the home. Things like domestic violence and alcoholism were all taboo. You couldn't talk about any of that. So the mothering in the home was the only place women had power. And in those earlier generations, motherhood also meant a loss of self. There was, you weren't able to be encouraged to meet your other potentials. So a lot of, and no one could talk about this also, right? So a lot of frustration and deprivation has been felt by our mothers and grandmothers. And this had nowhere to go except into the mothering relationship. So a lot of underground, shadowy feelings and dynamics got played out in the home. So this is kind of about bringing out into the light more of the truths of how we've suffered. And it's not about blame, as we said, but it's about shining the light. And because we're in a time where we're looking at things that we've accepted that aren't necessarily good for us. And so it's in the spirit. This is really the spirit of the book and the spirit of the work.
Why does it feel like blame, you think? Anytime we look at our mothers and we have to look at the whole mother and who we become as women and why we are the way that we are, why does it feel like blame, you think?
I think it's because in our culture, women generally just don't have power. They're told over and over again that we're less than. So this creates a kind of power dynamic between women where there's this kind of enmeshment, this sense that well, if she's powerful, I can't be powerful. Or if
Right.
she gets the love, then I'm not going to get the love. It's a little bit like scarcity. There's just like this undercurrent of scarcity between women that's due, I think, to the patriarchal atmosphere we live in, where there's a sense that there's not enough
Wow.
to go around.
Right. And so one of the things that you write about in the book is when you start therapy and you want to reclaim your voice, but you sense that there is sort of a competitiveness, if you will, that your mother, and I don't think it's conscious, I think it's very, very
No.
subconscious, that she
Mhm.
doesn't want to see you super exceed anything that she's done. So she really can't be happy for you when you start to grow into your potential.
Exactly. Exactly. I sense that, and this was unspoken. I think it was very unconscious, but there was this sense that she was interpreting my growth and empowerment as an attack on her, as a personal attack, and as an abandonment. And because I think there was this unspoken contract that she suppressed her pain for her mother, right? So she was expecting me to do the same thing, just to
All subconsciously, though.
this is all subconscious. I don't think she had any conscious awareness of this. This was just like a feeling inside of her. But she saw me as this enemy, for wanting to go beyond the dynamics that were painful for me.
And so as you're on the journey and you're starting to see this unfold and you're starting to own your agency, when then, and you kind of talk about it in the book where you're able to have this conversation with your mother. Tell us about that conversation.
Oh yeah, that was really the scariest thing I probably had to do at the time. Was I realized I needed to have a conversation with her. And I did it as lovingly and clearly as I could. But it was basically me saying, I realize that we have dynamics that have been going on between us. And I want to shift that into something healthier, into something that works for both of us. And initially, she was really open to that, which was great. But then I think she thought about it more, and she sent me these torrent of emails that was just like, "You're not my daughter anymore. I no longer have a daughter." So it became clear that it was extremely triggering for her, for me to want to have more of a voice in the relationship. And that was extremely painful. It was the most painful thing, I think, because I could sense that all my mom's rage was coming at me and I couldn't change it. I couldn't say, as much as I said, "I love you, I want to make this work. I'm not trying to reject or judge you. I want to grow with you." And she just didn't have the capacity to meet me there. It was the hardest thing I did, but I feel like I'm so grateful I did, because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have really known what my mother's limitations were, and to be able to grieve that, because in grieving it, I could accept it. I could accept her for who she is and really claim my own life in a new way, where I wasn't looking for her approval or her to see me a certain way. I could start to locate my primary source of comfort within myself and in other supportive people that did have the capacity to support me.
Wow. Let's take a break here, but let's talk about when you need something from your mother as a daughter that she just doesn't have the capacity to give. How do you get past that? How do you live with that and be all that you can be? Bethany Webster is our guest this morning, and we're talking about her book, Discovering the Inner Mother. Stay on point. We're back after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we're having one of those really hard conversations, and maybe a lot of daughters haven't even thought about the effects that their mothers have on their lives. Because by and large, Bethany, most people, or a lot of people, want to say, I've got the best mother in the world. And for a lot of people, that's really, really true. But if there are some limitations, and if you are in a role that you are not supposed to be in as a daughter, mothering your mother and continuing everything that your life is hinges on her happiness or how she feels or what she's doing, it doesn't make for a healthy relationship. And so when you have this conversation with your mother and she's totally broken because she feels like, I've done all of this for you and
Mm.
this is how you repay me. And she doesn't say that, but you can kind of feel she's saying that. I no longer know who you are. And so what I take away from the book is that if you had not been in therapy and continued in therapy for a lot of years, you wouldn't have had the power to say, I love you, but some things went wrong or some some things were unhealthy in our relationship.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that for a lot of women, there is this ambivalent feeling, about their mothers, and there hasn't been a place to talk about it openly without guilt and shame. And so part of the book is trying to remove that sense of shame and guilt and realize that talking about it is actually part of growth. And we can start to see unpacking the mother-daughter relationship as an inherent part of being a conscious, awakened woman, that this
Mm-hmm.
has got to be part of it. Because a lot inside that taboo of don't, love your mother or else, there's a lot of shadowy ways that we can hold ourselves back, can keep ourselves silent. And if we have the courage and the support to work on that relationship, and to also work on ourselves, really, because it's
Right.
really not about our mothers, like I said, it's really about ourselves, then we can go beyond a lot of those inherited painful patterns and beliefs that we've inherited. And I think it's crucial. I mean, the more I looked around, I'm like, this is really the missing piece,
Mm-hmm.
because the tension that can be at the center of the mother-daughter relationship is often around this tension of, can I be my full self, or do I owe my mother a version of myself that makes her happy? It's like this tension where we don't necessarily feel like we can be true and authentic,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or we risk her rejection, or we are protecting her from taking it personally if we want to go a different path or have a
Right.
different view of things. So, and this sense of hiding our true selves from our mothers isn't just limited to that relationship. It actually shows up in all these different areas. And part of the book is trying to help make that connection for women, that this relationship is really the linchpin in some of the most powerful ways we hold back. And it's really about, some of us, our mothers have passed. Some of our mothers are
Mm-hmm.
not in our lives. Some of our mothers, we might have adoptive mothers or stepmothers. But whatever the situation is there, you can do the work on yourself, to move through it, to move through this kind of wounding.
Sure. And so after you say to your mother, you have this conversation
Yeah.
and she comes out and she's angry because she probably feels that it is a rejection of her in some
Mhm.
way because she hadn't had the therapy that you have had. So she's not really even prepared for this. How then is that relationship restored where you can be who you are and allow her to be who she is? Because you
Yeah.
can't fix her.
Yeah, exactly. You can't fix her. And a lot of daughters, unfortunately, have that feeling like, I have to fix my mother, or I have to help her heal, or I have to, in order to be happy and well
Right.
adjusted myself, I need to make her be. But yeah, the healing is actually in learning to have a detachment from her growing or changing. So when we have these kind of situations where we see our mother's limited capacity, it's about grieving. It's about getting support and grieving through the fact that, you know, there's this thing called the impossible dream that I talk about that a
In the
lot of
book.
women have, which is this impossible dream that one day my mother's going to show up for me and be the mother that I want. And actually, which is kind of a survival mechanism that a lot of us developed when we were little girls, that if I'm just good enough, whatever good means, then I'll get the mom that I want. She'll show up for me again or whatever. But it's precisely in grieving this that we can actually take the wheel of our own lives as women. So it's about having the courage to face that she doesn't have the capacity to meet you where you're at, that it's not personal, that your mother has her own journey. She's her own separate person.
But how did you do it, Bethany? Because I have a friend, and I told you a couple friends, I shared this. Well, I haven't shared this with her yet, but she's been in therapy for a lot of years. And those hard times in her life where she has wanted and needed her mother, and her mother just doesn't have the capacity to show up for her, but she still grieves that. All these years later, as a full-grown woman, she still expects somehow these accomplishments, these things that I've done, that her mother will somehow show up. And she's always disappointed.
Yeah, that's so common to kind of go back to this empty well over and over. And how it helped me was actually just being with a really good therapist who could help me, who could fill some of those mother gaps, which is the gap between what you needed and what you got. So you need to get the support. This cannot be done without support. So if you have a therapist or a professional, someone who can help you to fill that role a bit for you so that you can get some of those developmental needs met, then you can internalize over time that kind of mothering presence inside yourself, where you show up for that. There's a little girl in all of us, an inner child who is longing for those things. So the book talks about how we kind of create an inner bond of trust between the inner mother. We cultivate an inner mother within. And I would say that's what your friend really needed, was because she was still operating from this childlike place. So in order to kind of mother herself, it's like a skill that we can learn with support to show up for that child inside. And over time, the bond shifts from the bond with the outer mother to a bond with our inner mother. And this is when we can start to feel an inner safety and show up much more empowered and confident in our lives. It takes time.
It does take time. Let's take a break here. But when we come back, I want to talk about some of the reflections that are at the end of each chapter. This morning, our guest is Bethany Webster. The book is entitled Discovering the Inner Mother. Stay on point. We're back right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we're having a conversation that I don't think that most girls and women really talk about as adults. And that's the impact that our mothers play on our lives, or the impact that our mothers have on our lives. And for the most part, mothers shape us. They're the nurturers. They're the caretakers. They're how we learn to be who we are. And most people say, I'm becoming my mother. But I think it's about, Bethany, taking a deeper dive into those things that keep you from growing to the next level, and looking at not so much picking apart your mother's shortcomings, but looking at those things that you inherited that are stopping you from rising. And in chapter 4, you write, what keeps the mother wound in place, and why does it endure? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that keep it in place. And we touched on a bit of it earlier. There's the stereotypes that it's not okay to look at your relationship with your mother, that there's something wrong with you if you have some hurt feelings or anger towards your mother, that you should hide those. That's part of it. There's also the cultural atmosphere that women, should be quiet and pleasing and self-sacrificing. So, we stay quiet and silent about this. And also, the stereotypes that mothers and daughters are supposed to be best friends. So there's a lot of layers of cultural pressure that we've had as women to not look at our relationships with our mothers. But I argue that this is where our power lies, actually, because those beliefs got bonded with love, safety, and belonging, which are our most deepest human needs. We need to feel loved, safe, and that we belong. And so it's almost like we bond with our mother's beliefs as deeply as we do with her. It's like it goes into the fabric of our brain chemistry. So our mother's beliefs start out as our beliefs.
That's right.
Our mother's, her feelings about everything from sex, money, what it means to be a good woman, what is it to be successful. These start out with our mother's beliefs as baseline. And in order to self-actualize and to live to our full potential, we are actually required to, update that and have our own individual version of what does it mean for me? What is sex, money, and relationships? All these areas. How do I want to live it? How do I want to actualize myself? So every generation comes with this desire to fulfill their own vision. But in a patriarchal society, there's this limitation of power and scarcity of power that women have that creates this like gnawing tension where doesn't feel safe to be yourself because you might offend your mother. She might interpret it as rejection. You might feel her being jealous of you, which is really painful. So there's a lot of things that keep us from looking at this, but I argue that it's precisely, especially for women, this has been the missing piece in feminism and women's empowerment, to get the support and the tools to unpack the mother-daughter relationship, not to blame, but to heal and to ultimately create the possibility that we can have more women power in the world, because we really need the genius and the power of women more than ever.
And I think I said it earlier, it takes courage to do it. And I applaud your courage, not only to do the work, but to share the work. And there's something that you wrote that I think is incredibly profound and powerful for every woman that may be experiencing this and doesn't really know it. You write, pain repressed is pain passed on. Anything you repress, you're going to pass it on to your daughter or to the next generation because you haven't dealt with it.
Exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really the truth. And this generation we are now, and the generations in the past, repression was the name of the game. No one talked about, the big things like domestic violence, financial troubles, hardships. Everyone hid it behind closed doors in the home. So the home became this place that festered all kinds of pain. And all of us have some degree of it, right? So it's precisely this place we don't want to look, that we must. This is where our power lies. And the world and the culture has told us, oh, don't go there. You're not going to survive it. But the truth is that that's not actually true. The truth is that that's where you're going to unlock your power and potential. And it's not about blame or any of that. It's like when you free yourself, you also free your mother on some level and all the women who will come after you. So I encourage all the women who are listening to, see yourself as a pioneer, as a cycle disruptor. We need to be willing to disrupt systems to improve them. And the family is a system, like other systems. It wants equilibrium. It wants the status quo, but the status quo for so many of us has been a source of pain. So I think this is a powerful opportunity to be a woman, like a powerful time to be a woman and to be a mother, because we're questioning a lot of the painful status quo that we received. And we're in a position now with tools and awareness to do things differently.
And so for you, how did it all end with your mother? How did the healing process manifest itself in terms of your mother feeling rejected?
Yeah. And it's one of these things where when you start this journey, you don't know what's going to happen. You're like, is the relationship going to get better or is it going to get worse? And it really comes down to two people have to be willing to work together in the spirit of mutual, cooperation and wanting to learn. And unfortunately, my mother wasn't in a position with her history and with her traumatic childhood to actually meet me on even ground to work together. So I actually don't have contact with my mother anymore. I had to make the very difficult, after many, many years of trying to make it work and trying to explain myself and couch everything in a way she could understand. I reached a point where I realized she wasn't willing to grow or to meet me halfway. So it was a painful, one of the most painful things I've ever had to do was to become estranged from my mother. But ultimately, it was one of the most empowering as well, as strange as that sounds, because I've been able to create a life on my own terms that's truly fulfilling and authentic. And I wish her well, of course. But, at the end of the day, if people are toxic and not, are creating a lot of a drag on your own well-being, the cost was just too high for me to include her in my life. And a lot of women have to make this choice.
And a lot of women don't have the courage to make that choice. They will just remain in the toxicity for the sake of that's mother.
Exactly. And I think that when I bring in patriarchy, I think this is part of it. It's like when we reject those beliefs that you have to make it work no matter what, that you have to sacrifice yourself to your detriment to make a relationship work. That's one of those beliefs that makes the suffering go through the generations over and over again. And I was not willing to do that. I chose myself, I chose my own life, and I accepted the fact that she has her own path. And I think
do you try to keep up with her, Bethany? Do you try to keep up with her in any sense, like, on the periphery?
No, not at all. See, I'm one of those women whose mothers is truly toxic. Mm-hmm. Like I had to get, I attempted to get a restraining order because she was so, she became obsessive that, it was really unhealthy. It was like unhealthy in the most extreme sense. So there's no contact, and and it's my safety. I actually have to think about my safety there.
Wow. It's an incredibly interesting book. Before we've got to let you go, Bethany, tell people how they can connect with your work, your book, and all that you're doing to empower women.
Sure. Yeah. You can come to my website. It's bethanywebster.com. I've got a ton of free resources, including articles. I have an ebook. And if you want to go deeper, I have an online course, which teaches the 7-step process that I teach on how to heal the mother wound and discover the inner mother. And I also offer coaching as well and do talks. So you can find all that at bethanywebster.com.
There you go. The book, again, Discovering the Inner Mother, a guide to healing the mother wound and claiming your personal power. Bethany, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Indeed. Hey, everybody, stay on point. We're back after this.